Good morning. It's good to be with you. Special welcome if you are one of our Sparwood family that are tuning in on video. If you are newer, you might not have seen me. I've been gone on sabbatical for the last 4 months, but I'm one of the pastors here at Mountainside. We are going to begin a new series where we're going to try to answer a question that has at different times been nagging each one of us. And it's a question that comes up when life doesn't quite go the way that we want it to go, when it doesn't kind of unfold the way that we envisioned our life would be, or maybe we discover that we're not becoming the people that we thought we could be or should be. And the question is this: how can I be free? Now, you may not have used those exact words because that question gets kind of communicated and pondered with some other words. We will say stuff like this: how can I move forward? How can I get unstuck? How can I change? How can I feel content? It's the natural questions that begin to arise in our lives when things don't go the way that we envision that they should go. And our mind starts to go and ask some of those existential questions. Now, if I gave you some time this morning to ponder that question, your own freedom and whatever that means, which admittedly is a loaded word. It's such a loaded word in our culture and in our kind of whole vocabulary that it's a word that is just as at home in a political slogan as it is in an ad for an SUV, right? We buy Ford Escapes and Jeep Liberties because we think they'll give us some more measure of freedom. And so we've got a whole lot of ideas of what does it actually mean to be free, depending on what your particular circumstances are, or maybe depending on what season of life you're in. To answer the question about how to be free is different when you're 16 as it is when you're 60. It's an answer that's in flux over our lives. When you're a teenager, freedom is what awaits you when you finally move out of your parents' house. If you're a parent of teenagers, it's the same thing, right? You're just like counting down the days till you're free again. If your kids are all gone and you're getting closer to retirement age, this idea of freedom starts to get fused with you no longer having to punch the clock and your time now being fully your own, and where you can call the shots. Each one of your days is your own. That's this idea of freedom. Our culture has perpetuated this huge lie that freedom comes with the number 55. Right? If you just have a robust enough portfolio, then you can, kick out of all your responsibilities and get a sports car and golf every day if the commercials are true. If you're in the middle of a difficult, unhappy relationship, you might think that the pathway to freedom is divorce papers. If you've wrestled with any type of mental illness or addiction, you know really specifically what freedom looks like for you. But here's the deal: wherever you are in life, I would wager that at some point you have, or are right now, or will in the near future, find yourself longing to be free from something. Free from depression, maybe from a destructive habit, maybe from debt, maybe from health limitations, so that you could finally be who you've longed to be and do what you have longed to do. That's what in our culture we think is freedom. Now, even though it's difficult to describe what freedom looks like in your life, it might be hard for you even to kind of put the words together. What's not difficult, it's not difficult to recognize when we feel like our freedom is being impinged, when we're not free, when we feel like we're stuck, or we feel like we're trapped in life, or we feel like we're paralyzed by circumstances. Those are powerful forces that we can all recognize. I had a terrible lesson in this while we were traveling on sabbatical. On this one day that will go down in the annals of Barden history as one of our worst days as a family. Albeit we've had a very sheltered life, and so you can, take that into account if you're like, if that's one of your worst days, good Lord, you've had it easy. But this is a day that we will never forget, and it was a day where we as a family experienced a total and complete loss of freedom. Now, before we went and traveling, we had contacted all the embassies of all the countries we were going through, and we got all the appropriate documentation and visas, which is really smart to do when you travel through 2 of the 5 remaining communist countries in the world. It's really good to have your papers in order, and we did. And we had no issues until we were leaving Cambodia and crossing into Vietnam. We got up that morning and we had chartered a van to drive us. It's quite a ways out of this town to where this rural border crossing is, and we drove through the countryside all these kilometers until we come up to this really big, imposing building with imposing fences and imposing towers with imposing guards with imposing machine guns in the towers. And we come up and we queue up to go through the Cambodian border officials, and everything goes exactly as ordered. They open up our stuff and look at our paperwork, and they give us the stamp, and we exit Cambodia, and me and my wife and our 3 kids put on our backpacks, which we've been lugging across Southeast Asia, and we trek this 300 meters from the Cambodian border through no man's land over to the Vietnam border, where a guy goes, and where we arrive, there's communist flags everywhere and more guards in green uniforms and AK-47s looking very vigilant. And so we arrive, and a guy collects all of our passports, and there's a whole bunch of people queued up to continue through. And the first clue that something wasn't, something wasn't good was when all the people we had been queued up with and had traveled with had got their passports and went into the country and got on the bus that we were supposed to get on and left, and we're still waiting. And then a while later, a guy comes to us with our passports, and he says this, "Oh, this is very bad for you. You no enter Vietnam." And we're like, "What?" And you see, it turns out that when we had got all the other visas from all the other countries that we've ever traveled to, the visas were stuck into your passport. They're kind of glued in. So they're like a one-sheet deal. Well, the Vietnamese visa, which they had sent to us in the mail, is kind of 2 sheets. It's the size of your whole passport. It's got your picture and all the stuff in it. And they said to tape it in, which I told my wife we should do. And she's like, "That's a terrible idea, because we pull on our passports every day when you're traveling, and we're not going into Vietnam for 3 months, and we'll lose it. And if we lose our..." So my wife's like, "We should glue it in, like every other visa." So we argued, and she won, and we glued the visas in. What we did not know, that in Vietnam, unlike any other country, is that they stamp your visa when you enter and when you exit on the blank back of the visa. And if they can't get to it because it's glued down, your visa's no good. And so they tell us this: "Your visas are no good, you can't enter the country." And I'm like, what do you mean they're no good? They cost us $750, and we're right here, and you can see it's us, and we've got 5 months of trip planned and paid for, and he's like, "Nope, you have to go." So I was like, this can't be. So I'm like, well, if the issue is that it's stuck down, I'll fix this. So I go and I get out a Swiss Army knife, which you should not do at a communist country border with armed guards. Just a little heads up. I get out a knife, and I start really delicately, slowly kind of peeling the visa off the passport where the glue is, and really slowly trying not to rip it or damage them, and lift it up. And 3 of them come up really easy, and 2 of them, some of the white backing stuck to the passport, and so it's it's still white, but it's kind of thinner. You know what I mean? Some of the paper kind of came apart, and so I'm like, "Oh, but this is they can see it's us. They can see the visa's correct, and now they can stamp it." And so we go back up to the border, and we put our passports in, and the same border agent opens it up and looks at them, and he grabs a handful of passports and he throws them at my chest, and he says, "Go back to Cambodia." And I'm like, starting to get a little bit angry, and my wife is like, "Don't get angry. They have guns, and this, not a place you want to get into an argument." And there's no, they won't talk to you. There's no conversation that can be had. And so we phone the Canadian consulate, and we're like we're stuck here. Like, we got kids, and we can't get in, and this has been now several hours, and there's no water, there's no food, and my kids are crying, and we can't get in the country, and what do we do? And they said, "Well, there's nothing you can do. You got to go back into Cambodia. You got to go to the capital city. You got to go to the Vietnam embassy. You got to get new visas, which is going to cost you $1,500 US. And then you have to come back over. You have to get Cambodian visas to get back in, and you have to come back over." And I was like, "Oh, this is a nightmare." So I said, "Okay." So I grab our passports, and I trek back across no man's land, back to Cambodia, to see if we could get in. The problem is we had exited the country, officially. And you can't enter the country until you enter the country from another country. So they said, "You cannot enter Cambodia until Vietnam stamps an entrance and an exit in your passport." So they said, "You need to go back there, and you need to convince them to stamp an entrance and let you walk around the border and stamp an exit, and then you can come in." I go, "Good night." So I go back, cross no man's land, back to Vietnam, and I give him my passports, and I tell him the situation. I say, "Will you stamp it?" He says, "I will not stamp your passport until you have a new visa." And you can't get a new visa until you go into Cambodia. And I can't go into Cambodia until Vietnam will stop my passport. And they won't stamp my passport until I have a new visa. You can see the catch-22 that we were stuck in. We could not go forward. We could not go backwards. And at this point, my wife, who is probably one of the most calm and capable persons I've ever met. I mean, she can run an ER room that's got life and death chaos, and it doesn't rile her up a bit. She has, the only time I've seen her in my whole life, have a complete emotional and mental breakdown. Right there. She just goes to pieces. And my kids watch this, and my kids go to pieces, and my wife grabs my arm, and she says, I don't know how, but you get us into Cambodia, we're going to the airport, and we're flying home. The trip is done. And I'm like, yes, dear. And I'm thinking, no, it's not done. So I walk back across the border, thinking, like, what do I do? Like, praying for some creativity, praying for a solution. And I realized the problem was that we had exited Cambodia. If we hadn't exited Cambodia, we'd be okay. So I go and I find the nicest border guard agent there who seemed to be sympathetic towards us. And I said, hey, when we left the country, we had to fill out this declaration with a slip that you fill out, and they stamp it that you leave. And they don't have computer systems, so I know we haven't been filed on computers, just on this paper. I said, what if we get this paper and you change the date by 1 day? You give me 24 more hours. And he's like, I can't leave my post, and there's thousands of these pieces of paper. We can't find yours. And I said, well, what if I'll find it? And he said, okay. So he puts me in an office. He brings all these slips to me, and I'm going through everybody who has exited the country in the last month. I'm going through all these slips until I find all 5 of them. He agrees to give us 24 hours of grace, which we can get back to the capital city, where we can get to the embassy, where we can buy a new visa, and then we can come back and leave the country. So I come back across no man's land. It's been hours now. My family's sitting over there in Vietnam. And they're just all like having a meltdown. And so different people are stopping and seeing if they can help. And I come up, and there was this Cambodian angel. This guy who was a young guy who was fluent in Vietnamese, Cambodian, and English. We didn't have anybody that could speak for us. And he heard the situation, and he says, come with me. And so we go back over to the same border guard who threw the passports at me. And he starts talking, and I see they're having a conversation, and they're flipping up the visa, and the guy shows them how they're fine on the front, and he shows them the little bit of white paper that's ripped in the back. And the guy asked him the question that I didn't ask that needed to be asked. And the question was this: how can they be set free? What will it cost for them to leave no man's land? And so they have this conversation, and it comes back that all it takes is a special administrative fee of $100 US in cash. It has to be US dollars, and it has to be cash. And I'm like, this is great. Like, this isn't great because it's totally corrupt, but I'm like powerless. And this is way better than any other alternative I have. And so I'm like, we're back in business. Kimberly, all we have to do is give us a special administration fee of $100, and they're going to take our visas and stamp them, and we're good to go. And so we pull out our money, and we have $27 US. At which point, my wife starts begging the guy to let us in. And I'm so angry that my wife has been reduced to this, and he has total disdain for her, like totally just like, get away. And he won't take the money. He's like, it's not enough. It's $100 or you go back to Cambodia. So then I said, well, is there any way I can get some more money? Is there a bank somewhere I can go to? And he says, yes, 10 miles down the road, there's a town and there's a bank there. I said, well, will you let me into the country to go to the bank? And he said, yes. So I walk across the border with no visa, no passport, illegally in a communist country. I tell my wife, there's a good chance he might phone his police friend, and they might pick me up, and this isn't going to cost us hundreds of dollars. This is going to cost us thousands of dollars. So if I don't come back, call the consulate, and this is what happened. And so I get on this, find a guy, and I pay him $10 and put me on a motorcycle, and I drive, and every time we pass a police officer, I'm like, please Jesus, no, please Jesus, no. We get the money, we put it in our passport, we slide it through, and that was the ticket. We were able to be free again. But here's the deal. Like, in that tangible object lesson. I learned this like metaphor that we in different ways experience in life, where we feel like there are forces that are at work that are bigger than us, that are keeping us from going where we need to go, that are holding us back, that are trapping us. And those are forces that are at work in your life. Some of those forces are internal. They might be destructive habits that you can't seem to shake, or a past that's working so hard to try to keep defining your future. Sometimes we have a worldview shaped by our culture of what freedom is that actually enslaves us to the freedom that God offers us. Sometimes there are external forces, there are circumstances that we can't seem to control and we can't seem to change, that keep trying to hold us back and hold us down. And sometimes there's spiritual forces. They're at war against you going forward the way God would have you go forward. And so over the next few months, we're going to try to do a deep dive into this question of freedom, a deep dive into this book called Galatians, and try to answer the question for you emphatically once and for all. How can you be free so that you are positioned in your life to be who you're meant to be, doing what you're supposed to do? Now, in order to get there, we're going to be led there by our tour guide. There's a guy named Paul. He's our freedom guide. And if you haven't been in church for a while or ever, if you're new to church, you've heard of Paul, you've undoubtedly read something of his at some point, because he's one of the most significant figures in history, arguably second only to Jesus for the impact he's had in shaping the Christian faith. He's this former religious Jewish Pharisee who's turned Jesus follower, who wandered the Mediterranean. He planted churches and he wrote letters and he helped countless people find true and lasting freedom. Now, Paul's story, his experience, his insight gives him this authority to answer that question for you. How can you truly be free? Now, early on in Paul's life, nobody in his high school yearbook, nobody would have predicted that he would have been the guy who was the Christian freedom guru, that he would be helping Jesus followers live lives that look like Jesus. Because when we first hear about him, he's going by his Hebrew name Saul. Paul is his Greek name. He's going by his Hebrew name Saul, and he's trying to put the church out of business. After that first Easter, there were countless men and women who were so overwhelmed with joy and wonder. They were utterly convinced that God had come to earth for us, and that God had died for us, and that God rose again, and in so doing he defeated sin and death for us. And they believed it, and they were overwhelmed with it because they saw this back from the dead Jesus. They saw it with their own eyes. And they start telling people this message, this good news. And it wasn't only that their message was compelling, they had lives that were just changed. Like they were just, in an instant, they were just saturated with all this joy and hope and love as God's Spirit filled them. And many, many, many Jewish people started putting their faith in Jesus. Now, the religious leaders like Saul, they're horrified, they're outraged at this. Because these first followers of Jesus, who, remember, most of them are uneducated fishermen, they had the audacity to try to hijack the Hebrew Scriptures and were telling people that the only way you can understand God and the only way you can understand His plan for your life and what He's doing in the world is through the death and resurrection of Jesus. And they were outraged at this. They thought this was blasphemous because they were the experts. Paul's got this PhD in the law. I mean, he knew the law frontwards and backwards. He knew the Hebrew Scriptures forward and back. And he was utterly, just fanatical in his obedience and his compliance to it. And so Paul loathed this new movement. So much so that he threw himself into this search and destroy mission to try to root it out and shut down this new sect that called itself the Way, because they were following Jesus, who described himself as the Way. And so in fact, Paul will describe that period of his life like this. These are his own words. He says, "For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church and I tried to destroy it." Now, his trying to destroy it looked a lot like people being arrested for their faith. Some of those people who were arrested were tortured into recanting of their faith, and others were executed under the watchful eye of Saul. One of them was this Jesus follower, this young man named Stephen. And Stephen had his whole life and whole mindset and worldview changed by a resurrected Jesus. And he's just so filled with like hope and good news that he's out on the street corner and he's preaching and he's telling all these Jewish people, giving them kind of the history lesson of what had gone on and what they knew from their stories when they were little in synagogue, and bringing it all to this conclusion that this was all leading to this event, that Jesus, who was just walking the streets, who crucified, your religious leaders crucified, you asked for his crucifixion, he has been raised from the dead. He is God's Messiah. And the people were outraged and they blocked their ears, and some of the guys picked up rocks and threw a rock at Stephen and knocked him off balance, and more men started grabbing rocks and throwing them at Stephen. And just imagine the sound, the sickening sound of a rock against flesh or bone breaking. And as more and more people just start in a rage, start throwing stones at Stephen, his body becomes more bloodied and more bruised until finally he succumbs to the brunt trauma and he dies. And we read that while this was happening, under the watchful eye of Saul, he approved of the whole thing. Well, this act of Stephen's murder and this ruthless tactics that Saul was employing caused quite a panic in the church, and people, the Christians, they fled from Jerusalem and they took off to all points of the compass. But Paul is not deterred. He's on this righteous mission, and so he's armed with a pocket full of search warrants, and he heads to the city of Damascus because he heard there's a bunch of Christians there. And on his way there, in this dramatic plot twist, your Heavenly Father and mine decides to draft Paul onto his team. And in the course of a few hours, on a single afternoon, his whole world was upended. Everything that he thought he knew about what God was doing was turned on his head. Everything that he had been so confident in about what you need to do to truly be a free and alive and approved before God was reduced to ashes and dust. On a single day, Saul was going to go from being a destroyer of Jesus follower to being a Jesus follower himself. And why would he do that? Was he having a midlife crisis and just blew up his life? No. Did he think that torture and persecution looked fun? Want to get me some of that? No, of course not. Paul's whole world and worldview changed in a single afternoon when he comes face to face with the same overwhelming force that changed the life of Peter and John and Mary and hundreds before him. He meets the resurrected Jesus, and he would never be the same. And in that moment, when Saul meets Jesus, he could see the tragic irony of all of his self-focused efforts to try to keep the law, all of his crossing of the T's and dotting of I's, all of his religious fervor that he worked at day and night, led him to a place where he was working day and night to destroy the plans and people of Jesus. And so Jesus says this to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? See, Paul's religious devotion, his work-centered worldview became this external force that actually, shocking to him, left him trapped. For all of his devotion to God, these external forces left him trapped and outside of the freedom that God had for him. And he would have forever been on the outside, blind to what real freedom looked like if it weren't not for the undeserved, unearned grace of God that came to him not because of what he had done, but in spite of what he had done. And so this magnitude, you need to understand in Saul's thinking, this magnitude of Jesus' resurrection begins to fill and reshape all of his thinking about God, all of his understanding of the Scriptures, all of his understanding of what God is doing in the world. And he began to see that there was a radical new way for humanity and God to relate. And it was no longer based on obedience to 613 laws in the Old Covenant. It wasn't rooted anymore in traditions that he grew up with. That Jesus had brought something entirely new, entirely different. A new day had dawned. A new covenant had been created. Rooted not in what we do, but in what Jesus has done. And in that covenant, in that good news, there was power to truly be free. And I don't just mean free from regret or past or mistakes. It's all those things, but way more. You see, because true freedom, and we're going to be working out this definition for the next weeks to come. True freedom is the freedom to be your true self who God made you and meant you to be. That's what it means to really be free. Anything less than that is you'll keep asking that question, how can I be free? Unless you get to this place where you finally are released to be your true self who God made you and meant you to be. Well, Paul experienced that freedom. And he was commissioned by God to help other people experience. And so he's eager to do so. And so he sets out. He's got his Bible, and he's got his backpack on, and he starts trekking around the Mediterranean, and he just starts bumping into people. He starts telling them the good news, and people start responding because they hadn't heard anything like this. And there's a power and an authority in the way that Paul lives and the type of life he has that people are drawn to, and people start putting their faith in Jesus. And so out of these people, Paul starts planting churches, and he plants a bunch of them in this area called Galatia. And we know that they're good churches because in Paul's letter to the church in Galatia, he gives us some clues as to what they were like when Paul planted the church. And he'll say stuff like this, that they open their hearts not just to Jesus, but to Paul. They welcome Paul like they welcome Jesus. Which, that's a good church if you're a pastor. Right? If a church loves your leader like they love Jesus, that's a church you want to pastor in. That's a good church. Not only that, Paul says that Jesus Christ crucified was presented in front of them. And they believed it. Like they embraced the gospel. They put their faith in Jesus. He said the Spirit was in their midst doing miracles. That's a good church. If the Spirit of God is alive and stuff's happening, you see the Spirit at work, that's a good church. And Paul said that, reminded them that they had been adopted as sons and daughters, and they spoke to God as their Abba, their Father. And it speaks of kind of this intimacy and worship. The people, they just knew God the Father. All these signs, they love Jesus. The Spirit is doing miracles in front of them. There's intimacy with God the Father. They love the leadership. All this stuff is it's a really, really good church. And then something goes terribly wrong. These internal forces and these external forces come together to create this perfect storm that pulls them out of this freedom. In fact, they walk willingly out of this freedom that they had been gifted in the gospel, and they find themselves back slaves again. And Paul cannot believe what has happened. In fact, what is so shocking is that this kind of switch that happens was so deceptive and so sinister that the Apostle Peter himself, for a time, starts to give into it. It pulls him out of his freedom. This is Peter. Well, I say this to you because there are similar internal and external forces at work in our lives as well, in your life right now, that are the reason why you are not experiencing the vibrancy in your spiritual life like you thought you would, or that maybe you had once upon a time, or maybe that you heard in a sermon would come to you and you haven't got there. It's why you keep asking these questions. How can I change? And how come I can't feel like I'm fully who I'm supposed to be? And how do I shake this stuff off? And how do I be different? And how do I feel content? And all those questions are because these same internal and external forces are robbing us as freedom that robbed this same church in Galatia from their freedom. And Paul sets to writing this amazing letter that he prays is going to be the thing that brings them back to a place of freedom, that sets them back on the path of fullness and vitality. And I believe God preserved it for us so they could do the same for us today, all these years later. Because really, even though time has passed, our hearts aren't all that different. Our circumstances really aren't all that different. Our weaknesses aren't all that different. And here's the good news. Your Heavenly Father and mine is eternally committed to you being free. You understanding who you were meant to be, who you were made to be, and living into that life. So much so that Paul will say that the one who the Son sets free is free indeed. So, if that picture of freedom, or if that idea of not feeling like you're there, not feeling like you're stuck, and feeling like you can't go forward and feel like you're kind of stuck in an eddy and you just keep circling and circling in life and you can't kind of break free into the flow of the river and keep going downstream where God would have you. If you identify with any of that, then this book, Galatians, is going to be good news for you. So, come back next week and we're going to start our deep dive into the book of Galatians. Let me pray for us. Lord, I just confess that sometimes in our busy, hectic lives, in our busy technological world, our problems can seem really complex. And so we can convince ourselves that we have to find really complex solutions to our complex lives and our complex problems. But the truth is that even though our lives are complex and our problems are complex, the solutions are very simple. They're just hard. And that's why we look somewhere else. And that's why so many of our lives, we go into these periods where we just do not feel like the fullness of what you promise us to experience is being lived out by us. But there's these forces, powerful forces inside us, these powerful habits and this way that we see the world that is so hard for us to break out of and live differently. These powerful spiritual external forces, our own kind of internal drive to perform and do well and impress you can all actually get mutated into this thing that actually keeps us from you. It happens in my life, it happens in our life here. God, would you be so gracious and powerful as to speak forward from these pages, from the thoughts and understanding and wisdom of Paul into our lives so that each one of us can experience true freedom to be who you made us to be, who you meant us to be. In Jesus' name, amen. I look forward to next week getting into Galatians with you.